Hey everyone, how are we doing today? This is James Sweeney, aka SplitSüit, and welcome back to another video. And this is going to be the third install of the series When 3-Bets Go Wrong. And this is all about situations where we 3-bet and usually something odd happens. And I'm just going to, in this video, talk mostly about when our 3-bet gets called and we have to go post-flop. And usually with a range that isn't nuttish, dare I say. So these hands are all played at 100 no limit and are going to be done in our regular hand history style, so we will be using HUD stats and information when applicable. And I am going to be keeping in line with using Hero's HUD stats, so in case you're wondering what Hero is playing, Hero in this video is a 14-12 with an ATS of 41%, a 3-bet of 4%, and a fold versus 3-bet of 72%. And it should also be noted that Hero in this video does not always top off, so some of these hands will be played with odd stack sizes for Hero, and if you're kind of confused how that's going to be applicable for you, you can just kind of think about it if your villain had that stack size. It's kind of that same thought process that carries over quite nicely. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it, start having some fun, and talk about when 3-bets go wrong. Okay, this first hand we have Ace-Jack. There is a raise by Wintertime, and Wintertime is a 13-12 over 168 hands, ATS of 50, and fold versus 3-bet of 65%. So because of the title of this video, I'm sure you can figure out that we 3-bet in this situation, but as I've talked about before, and we'll probably continue to talk about a lot in this video, I don't particularly like the 3-bet. This is a situation where Ace-Jack is certainly ahead of his steal range, but by the same token, what does 3-betting really accomplish? This is someone who is probably not going to make a tremendous amount of mistakes versus the 3-bet, and also if we 3-bet here, are we happy if he 4-bets? Probably not. Are we happy if he flat calls? Well, a lot of his range is going to be pretty strong. Ace-Jack is kind of going to perform bottom side against that, in my opinion. And yes, we have the lead in the hand, but by the same token, we're playing out of position with a hand that definitely offers some reverse implied odds. Not particularly enamored in this situation, and I kind of wish Hero had just flatted this instead. Because when you 3-bet and the only real option that you're happy with is if your opponent folds, it usually means you're bluffing. And in a situation like this, why would we want to turn Ace-Jack into a bluff? So I'm totally fine just flatting this and playing poker, but Hero does 3-bet, Hero does end up getting called, and Hero goes to the flop out of position. And Hero makes a C-bet. As to the C-bet, whether or not I like it, certainly up for debate, based upon kind of my reads on Wintertime, not only on how wide he calls my 3-bet, and his full verse 3-bet stat is kind of dead center, but also on how he's going to play flops. Is he going to play flops straightforward, and so straightforward that he's folding things like 9s and 10s here, in which case I'm obviously pretty happy with this? Or is this the kind of guy that's going to call all of his pairs, he's going to call ace-king sometimes, that sort of stuff? So it's definitely based upon kind of ranges and basic range ideas. Because we're only betting half pot, it only needs to work give or take around a third of the time. So in this situation, I can be on board or against it. There's certainly some decent double barrel cards like the club and backdoor straight draws, so I certainly want to keep that in mind. But in a situation like this, again, I don't particularly like pre-flop, and flop becomes a little awkward because of it. But Wintertime does decide to call, catch an ace on the turn, and obviously an ace on the turn is the best card we could have caught, so very happy about that, and Hero decides to check. So I can be cool with Hero's check here. Hero's check pretty much says that he doesn't think that the bet is going to accomplish anything. Pretty much assumes that if he bets, Wintertime is going to play pretty close to perfect, fold out his second best pairs, really only continue with very, very strong hands or hands that beat us. So in a situation like that, I can totally be fine with checking to induce some sort of bet. And once that happens, I'm usually kind of in like a check call mode, unless I have some serious history or dynamic. But in this spot, when Hero goes for the check shove, I'm not really in love with it, because is Wintertime going to make enough mistakes against it? Yes, we are giving Wintertime 2.7 to 1 here, which, okay, that's cool, but is Wintertime going to call here with naked Queen X, or Kings, or even Jacks or 10s? Or is he only going to look us up with hands that beat us, things like Ace Queen, Ace King, sets, that sort of stuff? So I don't think this is a spot where Hero fully thought it through. I think Hero just got really excited that he caught an ace and kind of just went into kind of brain fry mode. And it's really important that when you do catch the ace here that you're really thinking, okay, what do my bets accomplish? And if I do induce a bet, is a check raise really going to do anything? If I don't have the kind of history or dynamic where this can look bluffy and I know that he can make some sort of hero call here, then it's probably not that worthwhile. And obviously it's different if Wintertime is a fishier player, because then it changes the way that he would call versus this check raise. But in this situation, I really only expect to get looked up if I am behind, and if hero folds, it means I probably lost a possible chance of letting him bluff on the riv. So this is a situation where I think hero could have played this a little bit better, pre-flop especially, and then on the turn as far as whether he check raises that or not. Like I said, if I'm going to check that turn, I'm usually in more of a check call mode and go from there. Okay, in this next hand there is a min raise from Never Calling, and it folds to us, and Never Calling is a 9-8 over 179 hands with a fold versus 3-bet of 80%, and hero decides to 3-bet. So I don't particularly love the 3-bet in this situation, simply because Never Calling is such a tight guy, so he's probably even tighter from early position. He does have that really high fold versus 3-bet percentage, which means that when we 3-bet him, he's really only going to be continuing with the strongest of hands. So a big question I would ask myself here is, if I 3-bet and he shoves, am I happy about that? Do I think that I'm going to be calling that 4-bet with an edge, or am I just 3-bet folding? I don't really like 3-bet folding against the 40 big blind effective stack, so that's first and foremost. Secondly is, even if he calls my 3-bet, am I expecting to be good? Is he going to call my 3-bet with something like ace king or pocket jacks or pocket tens? Because if not, it's not really all that good in the first place. So make sure you're keeping those things in mind. Obviously, I'm way more likely to 3-bet queens against someone who is just opening wide, giving action really wide, so fishier type players. But against better players, you want to be really careful when you are 3-betting things like queens, jacks, that sort of stuff pre-flop. But in this situation, we do end up going heads up, and we actually end up getting bailed out with top set, which always makes life nice and easy, and hero decides to check back. So I can be for or against the check. I actually have nothing wrong with just betting here. This is a really dry queen high board. We're probably not going to get bluffed into a tremendous amount of the time, which is something that definitely factors in here. I really like checking behind when I think it can induce bluffs and stuff on the turn, or overvaluations. So something like, say he had tens or jacks, that he would actually bet that on the turn. But I don't think that's going to happen a lot of the time here, mostly because, one, I don't think there's a tremendous amount in his range that could or would bluff. Things like ace-king and stuff are kind of up for debate whether he'd even call the 3-bet versus 4-bet it. So I don't really think that's going to happen. And then I just start asking myself, okay, how does his range tweak? If he has something like, say he flatted it with kings, or he flatted the 3-bet with jacks or something, would he make a calling mistake here? So I might consider going for something like a half pot bet, something like 6 or 650, try to induce some sort of calling mistake, mostly because I don't think I can induce a bluffing mistake, and it's just kind of a go for value type thing, get the pot growing. Again, I kind of don't love pre-flop all that much, and post-flop's going to be a little bit awkward regardless. So hero checks, 6 on the turn, we face a bet, which I'm obviously happy about at this point, and hero decides to min raise. So I can be okay with the min raise. I'd probably go a little bit larger, something like 15, simply because there are some river cards that could F up action. Things like a 5 or a 3 might slow him down, maybe a club rando slows him down. But obviously the raise is strictly for value. But again, I really don't ever get to the turn like this, mostly because pre-flop and flop are usually pretty different. But he decides to call, 3 on the riv, he checks, and at this point hero's obviously in a shove mode. And I'm happy the hero shoved here as opposed to getting scared of the 5, because obviously I'm pretty sure I'm never ever behind here. If never calling is bad enough to have something like pocket 5s here, then I'm really not worried about anything. But in this situation, the shove is totally good as played, and we do end up actually getting looked up by 9s. So I would definitely want to make sure that I take a little bit of a note on that he did call my 3-bet out of position with 9s. He did end up stacking off second pair on a queen high board post flop, which in the future is going to change the way that I 3-bet this person. Because as a default, given the stats that I had going into this hand, I couldn't really assume that he would make this kind of mistake with 9s pre-flop. After seeing this, obviously that's going to change my opinion in the future. So sometimes when you quote-unquote make a mistake, or you make maybe a suboptimal play, and you end up seeing cards, it's going to change your future decision. So this is why you definitely want to make sure you're taking notes, thinking about the ranges that he's using, the way that he's valuing post-flop, and then obviously make decisions in the future more optimally from there. Okay, in this next hand we face a raise from Boiler Room and a folds to us, and Boiler Room is a 2119 over 213 hands, ATS of 69%, and fold versus 3-bet of 91%. So this isn't the most common player type in the world, but good God are they profitable. So these are the kind of players that steal almost every single time they have the chance to, and fold versus 3-bet even more than that. So this is someone that I want to be hammering with a bunch of 3-bets and re-steals. This is just someone who's opening too wide, continuing way too tightly. So there's just a lot of folding happening from a player like this. So make sure to turn a lot of stuff into bluffs and semi-bluffs against them. So in a situation like this, I couldn't really flat A7, 8-7 suited. So it's a situation where I really want to be 3-betting it against a player like this. So I'm happy with the size, happy with the idea. Everything looks good from here. So Boiler Room calls, go heads up to it, flop a two-way straight draw with some overcards, and Hero decides to lead. As a default, I can be okay with the lead, trying to get folds from things like Ace-King, Ace-Queen, maybe get a double barrel attempt against things like the medium-ish pairs, like the 9s through jacks type stuff. So I'm totally on board with this kind of bet. You could definitely consider going for a check shove, given the stack sizes, but as played, I can totally be cool with this. But we do end up facing a raise from Boiler Room. So this is one of those times where we could pull out our trusty fold equity calculator and make some decisions from there. So at this point, if we bring it out, the effective stack size that we're shoving is going to be 58.5. The size of the pot is what's in the middle right now, which we can add up very easily. And then we have to estimate our equity. So same as always, need to pull out Poker Stove for that. See, we have Ace-7 suited, so if I can speak correctly. We have the board right here, and now we have to estimate our opponent's range. So let's just take a worst case scenario and say that he only does this with sets and queens plus, which is pretty worst case. Eval that, and you notice we have 36% equity, so just plug that right in there. Submit that. And you notice that this shove is plus EV even if villain never folds. So if the range that he would raise with and call with is that sets and queens plus, this is still a perfectly profitable shove, really no problems. And obviously if we take a less worst case scenario, so bring Stove back out and say instead of that he does this with all of his overpairs and evaluate that, you notice that we get a little bit of an equity boost, so it's obviously going to be even more profitable. So something else I wanted to look at real quick is how interesting this would be if we started the hand with full stacks, because obviously in this situation we did not, which of course changes everything. And let's just assume we did, and at that point we would actually be risking a different amount here. We would be risking 84.5 as opposed to 58.5. So let's just put that right there, 84.5. The pot size is still the same at 49.5, and the estimated equity. So let's take that worst case scenario again looking at sets and queens plus, and obviously at this point we have 38% equity. I'm sorry, I did not push evaluates. 36% equity. Good, and submit it. And you notice that at this point we actually need some folds in order for this to be break even. So we need 10.5% folds just to break, which means that I'd probably want something closer to 25% folds. Obviously against this range I can't expect much any of this to fold if I go for a 3-bet, which is definitely going to skew everything. That would skew... But I mean, deeper stacks are going to change everything in the first place. They change the way I play the flop as far as do I bet, do I check raise, do I check call, changes all of that. And it also changes the ranges, changes how strongly he would stack off, it changes the way that we would approach everything. So definitely make sure you're keeping that in mind. This situation is a lot more complicated as there's more and more stack depth, but when the stack sizes are a little bit smaller, starting the hand with only 75 big blinds, so it's the same concept if our opponent had 75 big blinds, this is a situation where, as we saw earlier, this is a very easy shove for Val, and even if he does end up calling with aces, again, that was still profitable given the math that we ran. We couldn't really call the flop raise anyway. So we do end up improving, which is always fun. But again, using some math and just some general Poker Stove stuff, this can be a very profitable situation to take a line where we 3-bet shove the flop. But again, make sure you think about how things change when there's more stack depth with either full stacks or maybe say 150 big blinds stack depth. That definitely changes our thought process both on the shove and the way that we want to be 3-betting and c-betting and everything in the first place. Okay, in this next hand we have Ace-5 suited. There is a raise from my ace never wins, and he is a 14-14 over 7 hands with an ATS of 100%, and that ATS is pretty much out of just 1 out of 1, and it's 7 hands. So I really can't read too much into these stats. They're kind of useless, and this player is essentially just an unknown. So Hero decides to 3-bet, and I don't particularly like that 3-bet, mostly because why do we want to be 3-betting an unknown player? We don't really know how he's going to react to it, and just as a general default, I don't tend to do a lot of bluff 3-betting against unknowns, because why would I? I don't know how he plays, I don't know if it's going to be profitable, and especially against like cappers, without some info, I usually don't want to be too crazy against them. Just kind of let them do their thing and just play poker from there. So as a general default here, I really would just be folding and not feeling too bad. With some info, high full versus 3-bet or some information on how he plays against 3-bets, I can totally be cool with this. But otherwise, I would just say forget it and fold. But we do end up facing a shove, and we're in kind of a situation where we're getting 1.7 to 1, and we need at least 36.7% equity to break, and we have to do some math. So we can pull out Poker Stove here and start making some decisions. So we have ace-5 suited, and let's start talking about ranges. So let's take a tight range from our opponent. Say he's only going to be shoving here with 10s plus and ace-king, which is probably pretty tight fare, and you notice that we only have 31% equity here. Now, we know, based upon the fact that we're getting 1.7 to 1, we need at least 36.7% equity to break. So against this range, this is the easiest fold in the entire world. No problem, no questions asked. Easy. Let's take a slightly wider range. Let's take 7s plus, ace, queen, and king, queen suited. So do that, a valet, and you notice that we only have 33% equity. So still not enough. Let's go really wide here. Let's go deuces plus, ace-jack plus, and heck, we're throwing ace-10 and king-jack as well. And avow that. And you notice at that point now all of a sudden we are good enough to make a call getting 40%, having 40% equity against that range. So in this situation, I put heavy emphasis on that break-even aspect, and the reason being is because you don't want to call here and just break even. You want to actually make profit in this situation. Whenever I'm putting my entire stack at risk pre-flop, I better know that it's going to be generating an edge for me, and a sizable enough edge. I don't just want to call and break even, and all of a sudden I'm exposing a massive amount of money, just hoping to win coin flips. I mean, what's the point? So that's not something that I really want to be doing. So in this situation, I really like him to have some like bluffy type stuff in here, because then at least my equity starts booming up and then I'm happy. And in a situation where I need at least 36.7% equity to break, really, realistically, I'd like to have at least 42% equity. And that number is kind of arbitrary. It's just kind of a number I use for myself to make me focus on making sure that my calls are profitable in this scenario. And the reason why I want there to be such a big difference between the break-even price and the price that I actually want, or the equity that I need and the equity that I want, is really because there's margin of error here. I could be wrong. I could easily be overestimating his stack-off range. So if I'm performing pretty well equity-wise against a relatively tight range, obviously in the case that maybe he's getting a little bluffy here, making some mistakes, then obviously my call is even better. I don't want it to be a situation where I'm calling to break even in a best case scenario, or I'm calling for a 1 or 2% edge in a best case scenario. So this is why I run this kind of math problem against various ranges, really get a good concrete idea on where I look. And then really, I mean, realistically think about how wide his range needs to be. I mean, he needs to have 15.5% of his range shoving here in order for me to be doing well, really well equity-wise. So I definitely want to keep that in mind here. So I think just as a pure default, this is a very, very easy fold. Again, I would have just folded to the steal, yet alone to the shove, but Hero decides to call. So I would definitely, if you do end up making this mistake call, definitely make sure you take a note and just simply go from there, especially if he ends up showing something crazy. Him showing ace-king doesn't really tell me too much. It just tells me that he didn't call my 3-bet with it, which, again, doesn't really tell me much against a normal, decent capper. So make sure that you're being disciplined in this scenario, not just with the 3-bet, but also with your off-the-table exploration, really understanding how your equity changes against various ranges, and really understanding, again, don't take the break-even setups. Take setups that are actually going to generate an edge for you. Okay, in this next hand we have Ace Queen. There is a raise from HH, and at this point Hero decides to 3-bet. HH is a 2117 over 397, ATS of 51, fold versus 3-bet of 69. And as I've said before, and probably will continue saying in the future, this is a situation where I would much rather just flat. We have a hand that crushes his steal range. When he gives our 3-bet action, I'm not really happy about a 4-bet. I'm not really happy if he flats and we have to play that awkward spot out, especially because I think he's going to be calling pretty strong to the point where Ace-Queen doesn't perform as well as I'd like it to. Whereas if I just flat, I keep in the entirety of his steal range, I have position, this is just going to be an absolute crush situation if I flat here, and I'd much rather do that than just 3-bet, unless of course there's some history where I need to start shifting my Ace-Queen into a 3-bet for value range, which oftentimes that is not going to be the case. Another thing you want to be thinking about are the players behind you in this kind of situation, especially if there's fishy players. In this situation, infinity is an unknown, but just in general, make sure when you're doing your re-steals, whether they're heavy or light, think about the people behind you as well and think about how you can generate edge against them, if at all. Mac fold, HH fold, so we go heads up against infinity, and we whiff the flop with him checking to us. So in this situation, Hero checks back, and I really like the check back. I don't think I'm going to be able to generate a lot of folds here. He's an unknown, so I have no idea how the heck he's calling 3-bets. I have no idea how he's going to react to a C-bet. And in a scenario where my 3-bet goes wrong and I whiff the flop, without some decent information or some decent equity or some sort of hand thing, most of the time I'm just in a spot where I'm just going to say, okay, fine, I'll just give respect to you, let you pick the pot up, because I acknowledge that when I check here, I'm probably going to be facing a bet on the turn a fair chunk of the time. It just kind of is what it is. And again, this is just kind of the spot that happens sometimes when you're against unknowns. You kind of have to play a little bit more ABC. You're a little bit more reliant on hitting hands to whatever extent. And in a situation like this, I have no problem just saying forget it and folding. So again, big things to take away from this one. The 3-bet preflop, didn't really appreciate it. The check behind on the flop, I really liked that. I thought that was very disciplined by Hero. And obviously, expect that when you do it, you're probably going to induce a turn bet, and in that situation, very easy spot to find the fold button and just move on to the next hand. Okay, in this next hand we have Ace Jack. There is a raise by High Five, a call by Pink Panda, and it is our action. So High Five is a 1611 over 229, ATS of 24%, fold versus 3-bet of 80%, and Pink Panda is a 22-0 over 9. So in this situation, Hero decides to squeeze, and I can be for the squeeze, especially with the mindset of I think I'm going to get High Five to fold and get Pink Panda to myself. This is kind of one of those awesome situations where I can do that and expect Ace Jack is going to have some sort of edge. And obviously I have position, I have skill, I have all that good stuff in my favor. Definitely want to make sure I check the two guys behind me, make sure they're not very fishy, make sure I can actually get Pink Panda to myself a lot of the time. You could consider flatting here as well, wouldn't be horrifically against that, because at least you still have position on Pink Panda and you have a hand that can play out okay, but otherwise I can totally be on board with the squeeze. I'm really not that against it. So we get an ace, Pink Panda checks, and Hero decides to lead out strictly for value, I hope. So overall, so far so good. I like the lead out on this kind of texture, especially when there's some kill cards like the deuce and the tray. And also, any pair 6s plus should feel pretty comfortable with only a single overcard. So again, strictly a bet for Val. I even have no problem going to pinch large or something in the 14 ballpark, but again, a little nitpicky. So Pink Panda calls, Jack on the turn, he checks, and Hero decides to check back. So I really don't like Hero's check back here. In a 3-bet pot, when we catch 2 pair or better, especially top 2, usually it's a situation where I'm kind of in a mental stack-off mode already. And that's just based upon my hand strength. Now, when I actually think about everything else like I'm supposed to, I'm saying, okay, this is a situation where there are definitely a lot of kill cards on the riv. Not only cards that could shut down action, but could also beat me. Things like a club, things like a deuce, things like a tray. So it's a situation where I really just want to bet strictly for value against someone like Pink Panda. I think that he's shaping up to be a fishy player. I think that if he has an ace-x, he's pretty much never going to find the fold button. There are so few combos of flushes that make any sort of sense. So this is the kind of spot where I really just want to be betting for Val for the times that he gets sticky with something like kings, queens, ace-x, whatever it be. I just really want to be nutting value here. So I would leave this out for probably something like 37 with intentions of getting the rest in on a clean riv. But in this spot, 8 on the riv, he checks, hero bets, and he bets this really small number. I think this is gapping way too much value. There's just no reason to think that we're in this much of a showdown value mode, or that we're not going to be able to get a bigger bet of value off Pink Panda. So it's kind of a spot where, again, if I were leading this, it'd still probably be in the 36, 37 ballpark, same as it would have been on the turn. I just think Hero kind of gapped himself out of quite a bit of value. Now in this situation, we do actually end up facing a check min raise essentially, and Hero just flat it, and I'm fine with obviously calling the check min raise. And to be honest, Hero's weird line actually did end up saving him money, but this isn't a very rare scenario that this is ever going to happen. There's so few combinations of flush draws that make sense, given that ace-x flush draws should have check raised the flop a lot of the time, just given the way that most average fish tend to play. And also, if he's bad enough to call a suited connector, he's bad enough to have a whole bunch of other junk as well. And the only other real flush draw on the flop was like king-queen of it. So this is a situation where don't even worry about the outcome. The outcome doesn't matter. Just in the long run, make sure you're punishing players like this, players that are shaping up to be fishy, players who will just pay you off pretty much relentlessly. And when you snap big in that 3-bet pot, again, I'm kind of fine with the squeeze pre-flop, but I really want to see Hero play this post-flop better, especially that turn. And even still, the flop and the riv size as played, I think, could have been a little bit bigger as well, strictly for value against this kind of player type. Okay, in this next hand we have ace-king. Minx decides to open, and Minx is a 36-36 over 14 hands, so shaping up to be an aggro tard, but over 14 hands this could easily just be a taggy player that's running a little card hot, so it's kind of tough to say, but so far he's shaping up to kind of be a very aggro guy, opening each hand that he's playing and playing roughly a third of hands. And Hero decides to 3-bet, so I'm totally on board with the 3-bet here, totally for value against him. If Minx decides to shove pre-flop, I fully intend on snapping it off and taking a note on whatever he had. And that's always something that you want to be thinking about when you're 3-betting ace-king, is how are you going to react if you do face the 4-bet. And obviously, if you're comfortable stacking it off pre-flop, you think you have an edge in that spot, that's fine. And then also have a plan for the flop, because you know that it's going to be that smaller SPR, give or take around 2 against the stack size that Minx started with. So in this spot, we end up catching top pair on a very, very wet, draw-heavy connected board, and actually Minx decides to shove. So this is kind of a interesting spot, and one where we can actually pull out Poker Stove to do some analysis. So right here we are getting 1.5 to 1, which means that we need at least 39.5% equity to break even. And again, I'd like some buffer built into that for the times that I'm incorrect. So first and foremost, let's just go into Poker Stove. We see our hand, and let's just take some worst case scenarios on this board. Let's say that he has jacks, queens, kings, and the chopper with ace-king, and then also aces. So this is kind of a worst-case scenario. And you see here that we have 31% equity. We need at least 39.5 to break. So against that shove range, if you think that that's really what he has, this is an easy situation to fold. Now, if we change the range a little bit and say widen it up, maybe say he'd shove tens as well, and maybe an ace-queen suited. Okay, val that. Now all of a sudden you notice we're plenty fine. Even if we take out the ace-queen, go with val that, you notice that we're still okay. We have a little bit of an equity edge, and I'm fine in that scenario. So this is kind of what I like to think about in this spot. And also, maybe he doesn't always shove kings, queens, or jacks. Maybe he doesn't always shove the sets. So what we can do is we can discount those. Say we take half of each of them. So we're just kind of discount some of these. Same thing with jacks, val that, take out tens, just again kind of go back to that sort of worst case scenario. You notice our equity rises, but the second that we can throw in tens, then all of a sudden this is a spot where we are very, very comfortable stacking off. And also, if he's an aggro tard, there's the possible chance that he's being silly with something like, I don't know, maybe a jack X type hand. So maybe we're take some hands like, I don't know, jack 10. Queen 10, and we're taking ace 10 just to balance out the worst case, and throwing king 10 for the heck of it. Val that, and you notice that we're still fine. So this can be kind of an awkward situation in real time, facing a 2 times the pot size shove on such a connected board, just a top pair. So definitely make sure that you familiarize yourself with this kind of math and work. And again, this is all off the table stuff. This isn't complicated stuff, but you just familiarize yourself with it. You run through Poker Stove for a little while. All of a sudden this stuff becomes very, very easy. So definitely make sure that you do that, and also make sure you take a note. So one, against a different player type, I might not have even called the flop simply because this could be a range of hands that I don't do well against equity-wise. And if I do call and end up seeing something like ace-queen, I definitely want to make sure I take a note on that. Now, I could have assumed that he was the kind of guy that would make enough aggro mistakes simply because his stats were looking aggro, and of course sometimes I am going to lose like we did here. But overall, make sure you're taking a note on, again, kind of how he reacted pre-flop, what he shoved the flop with, and how he shoved the flop, and then just make some decisions from there based upon your math, the equity, and all that sort of fun stuff. So overall, not a very complicated hand. I like pre-flop, I like the flop, I like everything. Obviously, hopefully we don't get sucked out on next time, but overall I think Hero played this pretty well, assuming that he thought the ranges were what they were on the flop. So that's going to wrap it up for this video. Again, we talked all about some situations where our 3-bets went wrong and we had to see flops, and going post-flop and 3-bet pots can be kind of difficult. It's a little confusing, and because the ranges contort differently, it can make classifying your hand strength a little bit difficult. But if you really just break it down, think about what your realistic hand strength is based upon your opponent, his range, the board texture, all that sort of fun stuff, these kind of spots can be a lot easier. And also, we did work through a decent amount of math in this video. We worked through a decent amount of Poker Stove stuff, used the fold equity calculator as well. And these are all things that are very, very valuable and useful. And again, this is all stuff you really want to do off the table. Familiarize yourself with it. Start understanding how your equity changes as you add a bluff or delete a bluff or add a value hand or delete one. And all of a sudden you can get very, very comfortable with this math stuff. It doesn't take a lot of time to get comfortable with it, but you do have to put some time and effort in on your own. So same as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. Otherwise, good luck out there, happy grinding, and good luck in your 3-bet pots.